Look, Aristotle is one of those names that looms over Western civilization, or at least it used to when they were still teaching kids history. Now, he is the student of Plato, and when I'm forced to choose between the two of them after far too many drinks hanging out with my fellow history fans, I usually pick Aristotle as my preferred philosopher. Now, Kevin, I ask this understanding the impossibility of the task and the ridiculous scope, but could you summarise why Aristotle is an important figure in Western civilization?
Aristotle is central to Western civilization. His influence through Greek, through the Latin times, right down to now has been so profound. And he wrote, he thought about and contributed to discussion about topics ranging from physics to politics to ethics to economics. There's hardly an important subject in relation to how the world operates and how we should live together that Aristotle didn't have something to say, and even today remains foundational to much of what we describe as the West. So Aristotle is one of those seminal figures so far as our civilization is concerned, and to dismiss him in any way is just to show an ignorance of the civilizational history of the West.
Well, his fingerprints are all over Western thought, not just what he has written, but what people went on to discover based upon the works they read of his. And of course, not everything he said was correct, but boy, did he do a lot of work with not much detail to get his ideas from. Now, Kevin, we all know how reliable expert opinion is these days, and there's a little expert working in Beijing that said, and I quote, "Aristotle just popped up, and what made it more suspicious was that he seems to have an all-encompassing body of knowledge ranging from optics and ethics to economics and politics." End quote. Now, on a scale of 1 to 100% communist propaganda, where does this random outburst from the South China Morning Post sit?
Oh, this is somewhere between 1 and 5 in terms of its irrelevancy and being totally out of touch with the real world. As you quoted earlier, it seems to be that the Chinese regime, having decided that they can totally rewrite their own historical narrative, are now coming after the West and somehow pretending that they can totally rewrite the historical narrative of the West. Aristotle has been an influence for centuries upon centuries. It goes back beyond the 13th century. There are references to Aristotle in the Greek, in the Latin times. And so this is very important. And to just come up by some propagandists now in Beijing saying that, oh, Aristotle is unimportant, that narrative is unimportant to the West and we can rewrite it, just shows how, I think, firstly, bizarre the way in which the CCP approaches the West and approaches things which are intellectual, and just how, we should laugh at these sort of efforts, indeed, to try and underwrite our civilizational history.
Kevin, forgive me, why would a Chinese scholar wake up one day and decide to erase one of the most prolific and famous scholars from antiquity? It seems a strange thing to do. It's almost like he's trying to turn Aristotle into a conspiracy theory on the scale of flat Earth.
I think this is about the whole narrative which has developed, particularly under Xi Jinping, that the new Chinese empire, China is this great civilizational force, that there's been an uninterrupted narrative of history for 5,000 years, which is totally wrong, and that this is the recreation of it in China. And so part of that is not only building up this false narrative about China, it's also trying to undermine the historical narrative about the West. And if you can somehow pretend that people like Aristotle and indeed Plato and all the other great philosophers of the West down the centuries are unimportant or don't have the same status which we accord to them, then of course that goes towards, as I said, undermining the West and indirectly building up China.
Well, I mean, if you burnt your entire history to the ground halfway through last century, you might have to start reinventing a few things to fill in the gaps.